This was the largest audience to ever witness an inauguration, period, both in person and around the globe. These attempts to lessen the enthusiasm of the inauguration are shameful and wrong.
Maybe I'll say something good. Okay.
CNN has also confirmed the BuzzFeed scoop that there was talk of gifting Russian President Vladimir Putin with the $50 million penthouse apartment in the proposed luxury building.
Here's what I think happened to the United States in the past 8 years.
It's like oral kind of story. They're absurd.
He ended up polarizing the country in a way that brings us close to fascism.
But I would ask Russia is not to do anything, because I know if you have some sort of action, to only make it reciprocal. Do not make it go any further than you have to. You follow me, Ambassador?
And in accompanying that, brings Republicans to just hate rule of law.
So let's walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I want to thank you all. God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you all for being here.
You have to spin up the ball of thread before you can tell the story.
We're going to talk about Devin Nunes, Hipsy, and the role that congressional Republicans played in assaulting rule of law.
Devin Nunes is the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee that released this document. What do you think the biggest takeaway from this memo is in your eyes?
Well, I'm sad that we had to get to this point.
And a lot of this is going to be about the Hipsy report on the Russian investigation, things they did in 2017 and beginning of 2018 to pick up Paul Manafort's definition of the investigation as the dossier rather than the larger investigation, to serve as a collection vehicle for Donald Trump as basically snitches on the investigation to tell Donald Trump what was going on, and also to create a frame for the investigation.
The memo was sent to Congress. It was declassified. Congress will do what they're going to do. But I think it's a disgrace what's happening in our country. A lot of people should be ashamed.
We talked about Trump claiming he was tapped.
Starting at 6:35 a.m., the president sent a string of 5 tweets. "Terrible," he wrote. "Just found out that Obama had my wires tapped in Trump Tower just before the victory. He then hit the golf course."
But it all starts with Devin Nunes running to the White House and finding evidence about whether or not Donald Trump was wiretapped.
Today, I briefed the president on the concerns that I had about incidental collection and how it relates to President-elect Trump and his transition team, and the concerns that I have.
Now, in practice, those concerns ended up being that intelligence agencies had unmasked intelligence that revealed things Donald Trump was doing.
No, I think I've been very clear. There was no, and matter of fact, I've been very clear on this for many, many weeks now. There was no wiretapping of Trump Tower. That didn't happen.
And it turned into a multi-year obsession with Republicans.
And again, buckle up. Wow, huge, massive developments in the biggest scandal in American history.
My God, this is extraordinary.
Yes, the biggest political scandal of our time.
What did Barack Hussein Obama know, and when did he know it?
That you can't unmask what newly elected administrations are doing during the transition period.
Unmasking is when a senior government official requests to know the identity of a U.S. citizen in an intelligence report. It's something that happens thousands of times a year.
And we already described one of the reasons that was sensitive was because when trying to figure out why Vladimir Putin did not impose counter sanctions when Obama imposed sanctions on Russia in December of 2016,
President Trump praising Putin, tweeting, "Great move. I always knew he was very smart."
They went to existing FISA wiretaps of Russians.
Newly declassified documents identifying more than a dozen Obama administration officials involved in the unmasking of Michael Flynn.
And discovered that Mike Flynn had been undermining Obama's policy through the ambassador to Russia all along.
The way the Russians were talking about Flynn was regarded as what they called a 5-alarm fire.
That's one reason. The other reason is that the Emirates had come.
Stunning new details about a second meeting that happened at Trump Tower between the president's son, Don Jr., and a small group of foreigners offering to help Donald Trump get elected president. The meeting with Donald Trump Jr. included an emissary for 2 Arab princes and an Israeli social media specialist, happening just 3 months before the election.
Mohammed bin Zayed had come to the United States for a meeting with people like Steve Bannon and Eric Prince. And there was a Emirati tie to the Russians in this transition period.
It turns out that one of the people trying to help set up the secret Trump communications channel to Russia was the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates.
This meeting was a meeting with people like Steve Bannon, right?
Here's where it's going to get worse.
Trump's brain trust. And it was unusual for foreign officials to come to the United States and not inform the State Department. And they discovered it via wiretap. And with Nunes, there's always a concern.
I have a concern
that he's getting from Israelis that the U.S. is picking up stuff involving Bibi Netanyahu, which inevitably tells you what they're doing with Republicans, because Bibi Netanyahu is basically a campaign arm of the Republican Party, as we're going to see next month.
This is becoming a familiar image among friends. A black and white picture of Prime Minister Netanyahu pointing at the camera. The caption said, "Not only after me, they're after us." It's copied from President Donald Trump, who used a similar image with a similar message days earlier. The well-documented political bromance has been a focus of Netanyahu's messaging. In messages like this, Netanyahu has painted himself as the victim, while leaning once again on his relationship with Trump to boost his standing. But Trump borrowed this one.
I want to especially thank Prime Minister Modi, my friend.
Modi's supporters created and spread a meme, a picture of the Hindu leader with the words, "In reality, they're not after me, they're after you."
So Nunes comes out, oh my gosh, we have unmasking.
I think the question is was it masked? Why was it unmasked if it was unmasked?
And that turned into a massive scandal.
Yes, the biggest political scandal of our time.
That seemed to confirm that Donald Trump was right about being wiretapped.
This is a day the House Intelligence Committee wants the Justice Department to turn over any and all evidence they have that proves that Barack Obama wiretapped the phones at Trump Tower during the campaign, as President Trump has alleged. Are we going to have real facts on this afternoon?
The president called for the House and Senate Intelligence Committees to add this piece of the investigation to an existing investigation, and he's pleased that that is happening. We won't really comment further until those findings are complete.
Why wouldn't the president say to Jeff Sessions, his appointee as Attorney General, turn over to the American public evidence on this subject so that I can be proven right when I accuse Barack Obama of committing a crime during the campaign?
First of all, that sounds like a very incendiary allegation.
It was President Trump who made that accusation.
Nunes eventually sued the Washington Post for misrepresenting what he had done. It was called a midnight race to the White House to get this dirt.
Well, I'm sad that we had to get to this point.
He was suing the Washington Post over a report from 2017 that said that Devin Nunes is the one who came out and said that Trump Tower had been wiretapped by the Obama administration.
And it was dismissed, that lawsuit against the Washington Post was dismissed by Trump appointee Carl Nichols, one, because there was no malice.
Then they said, oh, crap, we got it wrong. Here is the correction, which, for the record, is what media outlets are supposed to do when they screw up.
But the other reason is because it was true that Nunes was trying to use this big "I ran to the White House" to fine-tune Trump's claim.
Why did you meet with a source on the White House grounds the evening before you came out in that news conference?
Yeah, well, if it's actually pretty common.
And Carl Nichols, Clarence Thomas clerk, now Trump-appointed judge, says even in March 2017, there was significant doubt about certain of Nunes's claims concerning surveillance of the Trump campaign. Although Nunes had not claimed, baselessly, that the Obama administration wiretapped Trump Tower,
he did suggest, baselessly, that he had received his information from a whistleblower and that the Trump White House was not aware of it.
Can you tell us who brought you this info?
Well, I can tell you this, that we've been asking for people to come forward, and they came through the proper channels. They had the proper clearances, and I'm just going to leave it at that, because we have to protect people who came forward in the right manner and got the information.
Is it an intelligence whistleblower, sir?
I'm not even going to say it's one person.
And then he goes on and talks about what was public. For example, when asked about Nunes's claims regarding surveillance in a March 28, 2017 interview with NBC's Today Show, Senator Lindsey Graham stated that, quote, The problem that Nunes has created.
He's gone off on a lark by himself, sort of an Inspector Clouseau investigation here, trying to find some unmasking.
Eli Lake of Bloomberg View wrote, Nunes told me his source for the information was an intelligence official, not a White House staffer. It turns out he misled me. Several other media outlets expressed doubt about the basis of Nunes's public statements in March 2017. In other words, Nunes said that he had a whistleblower, and in fact, the whistleblower was some guy in Trump's White House who was looking at intelligence and giving it to Nunes.
And he also, of course, said you can't prove any actual malice because they did issue the retraction and correction.
Carl Nichols was like, they didn't do this because they didn't like you. They did this because they fucked up.
I have a concern.
Another thing, which doesn't involve Nunes, it involves Richard Burr.
The North Carolina Republican heads the Senate Intelligence Committee, which is also investigating Russian meddling in the 2016 election.
But it's interesting because Richard Burr would go on to be investigated by Donald Trump.
It sure looks like potentially criminal conduct. The question then, unfortunately, becomes, how does Donald Trump, and by extension, Bill Barr, feel about Richard Burr's loyalty or lack of loyalty?
And as a result, he was replaced on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and Marco Rubio stopped short of concluding in the Senate Intelligence Committee on investigation on Russia, concluding that Donald Trump had colluded with Russia.
Is that what we want? Because I'll tell you, that's what Vladimir Putin does.
But back in March of 2017, Richard Burr sat in on a Gang of Eight briefing by Jim Comey.
Senator Burr may have leaked information on a closed-door FBI briefing to the White House.
So Gang of Eight is the minority and majority leaders of the House and Senate and minority and majority leaders of the Intelligence Committee. And Jim Comey briefed them on the investigation that they were doing into Russia.
Senator Burr's actions unveiled in the Mueller report have drawn sharp criticism across North Carolina.
This was not yet an investigation into Donald Trump. Burr called up the White House counsel, and they took notes of this meeting. And the notes of this meeting say that
Burr reportedly identified key administration officials such as Michael Flynn, Paul Manafort, and others as targets of the FBI probe.
This point, before they had gotten more communications on Flynn, FBI was wrapping up, DOJ looking for phone records. Those phone records would turn out to be really damning. Comey for Ukraine plus Russia, not campaign. This, as I described last time, was that they were investigating Manafort for his money laundering.
Manafort and his associate Rick Gates earned tens of millions of dollars for their work in Ukraine. They funneled it through offshore accounts, evaded taxes, and used it to buy high-end real estate and luxury cars.
But it was not yet that he was, say, giving polling information and strategy to a Russian spy.
The notion that Paul Manafort left Trump Tower to go meet with a guy who had ties to Russian intelligence and talk about the presidential campaign. I mean, their heads would have exploded if we had learned this in August 2016. And, the passage of time doesn't really make it any less stunning.
Carter Page, the dollar game, meaning that Carter Page was trying to get money from Russians.
I'm a free markets guy.
And Greek guy, potentially referring to George Papadopoulos, meaning the FBI was also investigating Greek guy.
This person could potentially organize a meeting for us with Putin.
And then finally, and this was wrong, and it's interesting, and it's a wrong detail that the New York Times ran with for a long time. At this time, in March of 2017, Richard Burr appears to have told Trump's White House that they were investigating Roger Stone. And he said, we can't handicap what that investigation looked like.
Roger Stone and Donald Trump being so close for so long raises additional questions about what the president, the now president, then candidate, may have known about these Russian contacts.
That's still 2 months before they were investigating Roger Stone. And Roger Stone was only ever investigated because he blabbed his mouth, as is normal for Roger Stone stuff.
I'm an agent provocateur.
So that was not true. But that point being that Republicans were going to Donald Trump and giving them details of the investigation.
So far, Senator Burr's only response is a statement from his office saying he, quote, doesn't recall this specific conversation.
The far more important thing, though, is an investigation that HIPSI did, House Intelligence Committee. And actually, Nunes was recused for a while, but this is when Kash Patel makes big. Right?
A former DOJ terrorism prosecutor during the Obama administration, he was personally recruited by Congressman Devin Nunes.
This is when Kash Patel, as investigator, becomes one of Donald Trump's most useful enforcers.
And as I read the rest of the application, there was no rest. So I said, Devin, we got a problem here. Either they're not showing us everything, or this is a serious issue and we need to dig further.
And of course, so the FISA, this is the Carter Page FISA,
right?
One of them.
The first
one.
And what happened in 2017 is the Republicans on HPSI were investigating one thing.
As soon as I got in, I asked to sort of dive deeper into the dossier because it was so public. And there was rumors that it was used to help further the investigation into Trump.
Democrats on HPSI were investigating another thing.
So you'd have to believe that these were all isolated incidents, not connected to each other. Now, can you prove beyond a reasonable doubt, will be Mueller's question to answer, that the Russians communicated to the campaign that the way they were going to deliver the help they offered and that the campaign accepted was not by handing the emails directly over to the campaign, but by publishing them.
In early 2018 is when we see the results of this investigation. January 18th, 2018.
President Trump authorized the release of a memo that claims the FBI improperly spied on his campaign, despite warnings from the FBI and the Department of Justice that the memo was inaccurate. Because if anyone's concerned with accuracy, it's Mr. 239 pounds. This memo came from 40-year-old virgin Devin Nunes, who is chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. I got to say, I don't really trust this guy to untangle a vast conspiracy. I wouldn't really trust him to untangle a pair of headphones.
This is after Paul Manafort, Mike Flynn, George Papadopoulos have all pled guilty.
Why all the lies? You were convicted of lying. Michael Flynn was convicted of lying. There have been other lies related to it from the podium at the White House. Why all the lies?
And the Mike Flynn thing was pretty important because, remember, I've posited my hypothesis that Mike Flynn was actually on a conference call with Trump for at least one of his conversations with Sergei Kislyak.
Do not make it go any further than you have to, because I do not want to get us in something that has to escalate on, a tit for tat. You follow me, Ambassador?
Mike Flynn on those FISA wiretaps said the boss knows about this. Mueller didn't include that in the report because he never believed he was going to be able to declassify FISA wiretaps, and then Trump subsequently declassified it. Had he been able to include that in his report, he would have been able to show that Donald Trump was involved from the start. And so when Mike Flynn pled guilty, that posed a lot of problems.
And
what difference does that make?
Well,
somebody go, oh, he's paid by the Russians.
But they come out, HPSI majority, at that point Republicans, and minority, then Democrats, come out with this memo laying out basically where the investigation started. Okay. And the story that HPSI tells is that it all started from the
unverified and fake dirty dossier that was paid for by crooked Hillary Clinton and the DNC,
which all started from Carter Page.
This is a real game changer if it turns out to be true.
In other words, this is where the story that Republicans all believe as an object of faith at this point, this is where the story came from, which is that Christopher Steele was
paid for by crooked Hillary Clinton and the DNC.
The FBI hid that fact from the FISA judges.
Unverified and fake.
The investigation wouldn't have started except for the
dirty dossier.
The dossier was critical to getting the FISA wiretap into Carter Page, and that the investigation was in its infancy when they got
the dossier produced by a former British intelligence officer, which the president called a, quote, pile of garbage, was the basis for the special counsel's investigation.
And you see what this story tells is that the dossier is everything.
The bulk of the subject matter of the FISA was the Steele dossier itself. And I found that unbelievable, like unbelievably remarkable in the sense that, is that it? Where's the rest?
In reality, what we know is that the investigation didn't move very far at all until Mike Flynn was caught on a wiretap talking to the Russian ambassador undermining sanctions, right?
You follow me, Ambassador?
Like at that point, they had done the FISA wiretaps on Carter Page. They had thrown a couple of informants at George Papadopoulos, but had not yet gotten his communication records, didn't yet know that there was a Russian that George Papadopoulos was working with.
He was unable to set up any meetings with me and any senior Russian officials.
Didn't yet know that there was a woman named Olga,
the Russian student who he purported was
the niece of Vladimir Putin, right? Didn't know that. Didn't know he was doing these Facebook meetings with this Russian.
He introduced me to a low-level think tank official in Moscow, Ivan Timofeev.
Again, Paul Manafort was just a money laundering investigation at this point.
It's absurd. There's no base to it.
And then finally, and importantly, the Mike Flynn thing, they were going to drop the Mike Flynn investigation, and then Mike Flynn blew it, stepped in it, got caught on a wiretap. And that's really when the investigation started. Mike Flynn, the response to Mike Flynn.
Overnight, the New York Times reporting Trump campaign aides and senior Russian intelligence officials were in contact repeatedly during the campaign, something the administration has previously denied. At the White House, meantime, new revelations: Vice President Mike Pence didn't know Mike Flynn may have misled him about a call with the Russian ambassador for 2 full weeks after the president was notified about inconsistencies.
It was strictly coincidental.
Nearly 2 weeks after that, the president's team was told by the Justice Department Flynn may not have told the truth. The president spent the next 3 weeks evaluating whether he could trust Flynn.
Mike Flynn is a fine person, and I asked for his resignation. When I looked at the information, I said, I don't think he did anything wrong. If anything, he did something right. And he didn't just call Russia.
And as if it were not busy enough here in Washington, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu meets with President Trump, with the White House now appearing to back off the need for a 2-state solution.
But the way in which Republicans have rewritten this entire thing.
It looks like the Obamagate scandal is about to get a lot bigger.
And when you hear denialists, they always ignore that timeline, that Mike Flynn was already a thing before the dossier was released, even in the public mind.
Flew over to Moscow to participate in the 10th anniversary
Russian
celebration of RT, Russian television, a propaganda arm of the Russian government, and you sat next to Vladimir Putin at a celebratory dinner. Were you paid for that event?
You'd have to ask the folks that went over there to
Well, I'm asking you. You'd know if you were paid.
Yeah, I mean, I went over there as a speaking event. It was a speaking event.
And
what difference does that make? Though?
Well, I mean, anyway, so the Republican memo basically says the dossier was critical to starting the investigation. The FBI hid important details about the dossier, including who paid for it, from the FISA judges, and that the Carter Page wiretaps were all important.
And in December 2017, then FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe admitted in a closed-door interview, under oath, that no surveillance warrant would have been sought from the FISA court if the Steele dossier had not existed.
Those have basis in truth, but they're not true.
Another Republican involved in drafting the memo has a very different take, saying, yes, it raises questions in his view about the process used to get one warrant, but not fundamental questions about the broader investigation.
The memo has no impact on the Russia probe.
Not to me, it doesn't, and I was pretty integrally involved in the drafting of it. There is a Russia investigation without a dossier. So to the extent the memo deals with the dossier and the FISA process, the dossier has nothing to do with the meeting at Trump Tower. The dossier has nothing to do with an email sent by Cambridge Analytica. The dossier really has nothing to do with George Papadopoulos' meeting in Great Britain.
Congressman Gowdy's going to get some phone calls from some of his conservative allies in the House.
They don't tell about the investigation. Now, the Democrats' response was particular. They're like, they did tell the FISA judge that the dossier was political. True. The investigation didn't start with Carter Page. It started with George Papadopoulos.
All we did was report what Papadopoulos said.
Absolutely true.
I have no idea why he was blabbering this.
And that's something that Republicans have always tried to obscure. Even John Durham tried to obscure. They hide the degree to which there are other aspects of Carter Page's background that made him a good target for wiretapping. This was before the full extent of the actual specifics about his relationship with CIA up until 2013 became public.
I had a philosophy at the time that it's useful to tell the truth.
But again, also before the specifics of what he was saying in 2016, which really led the FBI to become very alarmed that he didn't want the Russians to think that he was snitching on them.
You know, sometimes you have pretty harsh political actors working to achieve their political objectives.
So in other words, these are two different stories. They're both solidly based in the truth. They're both incomplete. They are talking about different things. The question is, what started the investigation? George Papadopoulos, running his mouth, started the investigation. What Republicans do a lot of work to do is suggest that the investigation wouldn't have happened without the dossier. The dossier was paid by Democrats, and the FBI hid that. And so those two reports in early 2018 are the object of faith of both sides. And I've got to say, at this point, Adam Schiff was still pushing the dossier.
You know, the plain fact is sometimes what is uncovered in opposition research turns out to be true. And here, if what Christopher Steele found, whether it was working for a Republican candidate and a Democratic candidate later, proved to be true, proved to be of concern to the FBI and to the country, then we need to know it. And we can't ignore it merely because it came to the surface during a political campaign.
I started raising questions about the dossier on January 11th, 2017, the day after it was released. There were far too many Democrats who kept defending the dossier.
So here the Republicans are less interested in what did Russia do and how did they do it and how do we protect ourselves, but rather let's shift the focus onto any kind of government misbehavior. And maybe if we can suggest that the whole investigation goes back to this dossier, and this dossier was opposition research, maybe we can discredit the whole investigation and maybe we can get the country to ignore what Russia in fact did.
When they should have said, we don't know.
Indeed, we keep on learning more and more.
There's a transcript that was released recently that John Brennan says, we didn't include the dossier because we had real problems with the underlying sourcing. We thought that the dossier could be disinformation, and this was in 2016. But the Democrats kept pushing the dossier. So they're both wrong. When the DOJ-IG investigation came out in December of 2019, Republicans were like, oh, Devin Nunes was proven correct.
Greg Jarrett, you're the author of Witch Hunt, the greatest mass delusion in American political history. The Nunes memo, you know, I believe, you know, completely vindicated through, of course, through the IG report.
Yes.
It's almost like if you read that, those 4 pages, you get a lot of the picture of those 400 or 500 pages.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
You know, the Nunes memo was 100% correct. The Schiff memo was about 90% wrong. The only thing that was accurate in the Schiff memo was the signature line, Adam Schiff.
And I did this very detailed analysis and showed what I just explained to you, which is that they were talking past each other from the very beginning. It's like that old story about 7 Indian men trying to describe an elephant, right?
The first approached the elephant, and happening to fall against his broad and sturdy side, at once began to bawl, God bless me, but the elephant is very like a wall.
Devin Nunes was focused on the elephant's tail, and Democrats were focused on the elephant's front right leg. Neither of them knew what the elephant looked like, and they were talking past each other. They were examining entirely different ends of the elephant, and as a result, that really fed partisanship. Again, the story that Hipsey told is exactly the story that Paul Manafort came back from a meeting with the Deripaska aide from and said, hey, Donald Trump, tell this story about how if the dossier is problematic, the dossier that, you know, Oleg Deripaska probably learned about before the second report.
Oleg Deripaska, not just any, Russian, the Russian.
Tell the story that the dossier is problematic, and that means the entire investigation fails. And that is exactly the story that Hipsey spent its first year telling.
What is happening? And the solution sort of manifests.
We're going to leave this portion of the Washington Journal. C-SPAN is back live at the Conservative Political Action Conference. We're getting ready to hear from California Representative David Nunes.
I don't know, Mr. Chairman. I think they like you.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
And I think it's important for all of our CPAC attendees to know that there's news breaking literally right now with the release of this Schiff memo. Our attendees are going to hear from you first. What do they need to know?
It just posted, so for those of you, the website probably crashed. Russian bots again, I'm sure, caused it to crash. We wanted it out. We want it out because we think it is clear evidence that the Democrats are not only trying to cover this up, but they're also colluding with parts of the government to help cover this up. And I think as you read it, you will see personal attacks on myself, personal attacks on Chairman Gowdy, with a lot of really interesting things that sound really bad, like a lot that has been happening with this Russia investigation over the course of the last year. But what you're not going to see is anything that actually rejects our memo.
And by the way, there's very good reason to believe Sergei Kislyak knew he was wiretapped. Diplomats overseas assume that certain kinds of their phones are wiretapped, and there is actually a part of the transcript where it seems they're playing to the wiretap, that they're speaking into the microphone because they know they're being wiretapped. And so when Putin did not impose counter sanctions, he had to know there was going to be an investigation. He had to know that the FBI would find Mike Flynn like a calling the ambassador to Russia from his hotel phone and undermining Obama's sanctions. But in any case, it wasn't until Mike Flynn lied publicly. There's a David Ignatius column on January 12th, which says Mike Flynn was picked up on an intercept. And then Mike Pence gets asked, what did Mike Flynn say to the ambassador? And Mike Pence says, Mike Flynn told me we didn't talk about sanctions.
It was strictly coincidental.
And that's when the FBI, that's when DOJ really start getting alarmed, because the incoming national security advisor is lying to the vice president about the calls he had with Russia. And at that point, and for until at least March, they believed, and probably until August, they believed that Mike Flynn might have been a lone wolf. They believed that Mike Flynn might be a spy unknown to Donald Trump, right?
Mike Flynn is a fine person. When I looked at the information, I said, I don't think he did anything wrong. If anything, he did something right.
So it took them a long time to understand that Donald Trump was involved. K.T. McFarland was involved. People at Mar-a-Lago were involved. And they were never able to prove that without relying on FISA intercepts. But at that point, the investigation into Flynn gets serious. And then the FBI does that interview on January 24th. He lies. He lies not just about Russia. He also lies about the effort to help Bibi Netanyahu.
A former National Security Advisor, General Michael Flynn's guilty plea in the Russia investigation yesterday. Well, it's focusing some renewed attention on a United Nations Security Council resolution regarding Israel. Court documents say that a very, quote, senior member of the transition team directed Flynn to contact foreign governments, including Russia, to help delay December's UN vote over Israeli settlements.
And then in a duty to warn, Sally Yates goes to the White House and says, dudes, you got to understand your national security advisor is lying his pants off.
The Russians also knew about what General Flynn had done, and the Russians also knew that General Flynn had misled the vice president and others. And that created a compromise situation, a situation where the national security advisor essentially could be blackmailed by the Russians.
Ultimately fires Mike Flynn thinking he's going to make the problem go away, right? There's Chris Christie testimony.
February 14, 2017, the day after Flynn's resignation, the president had lunch at the White House with New Jersey Governor Chris Christie.
Now that we fired Flynn, the Russia thing is over.
No way. This Russia thing is far from over. We'll be here on Valentine's Day 2018 talking about this.
What do you mean? Flynn met with the Russians. That was the problem. I fired Flynn. It's over.
Christie also told the president that he would never be able to get rid of Flynn like gum on the bottom of your shoe.
Towards the end of the lunch, the president brought up Comey and asked if Christie was still friendly with him.
Christie said he was.
Tell him that the president really likes him. Tell him he's part of the team. At the end of the lunch, the president repeated his request that Christie reach out to Comey.
Christie had no intention of complying with the president's request that he contact Comey.
But Donald Trump believed he was going to make it go away. And then he asked James Comey to make it go away.
At the end of the briefing, the president dismissed the other attendees and stated that he wanted to speak to Comey alone. Once they were alone, the president began the conversation by saying, I want to talk about Mike Flynn.
And that's when obstruction gets on the table. That's still February, right? That's Valentine's Day.
Thank you for including me in today's hearing. As you know, our practice is not to confirm the existence of ongoing investigations, especially those investigations that involve classified matters. But in unusual circumstances where it is in the public interest, it may be appropriate to do so, as Justice Department policies recognize. This is one of those circumstances. I have been authorized by the Department of Justice to confirm that the FBI, as part of our counterintelligence mission, is investigating the Russian government's efforts to interfere in the 2016 presidential election. And that includes investigating the nature of any links between individuals associated with the Trump campaign and the Russian government, and whether there was any coordination between the campaign and Russia's efforts.
But that's when 3 months later, things start to move to an investigation into Donald Trump. They didn't move into Donald Trump until...
Our lead story is breaking right this minute. President Trump has fired James Comey as the director of the FBI. White House correspondent John Yang. John, this hits like a bolt out of the blue.
The letters that Sessions sent the president recommending this move, and Rosenstein's memo recommending it as well. It appears to center around Comey's handling of the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails, ironically enough. Now, there's one interesting line in the president's letter to Comey firing him. He said, "While I greatly appreciate you informing me on 3 separate occasions that I am not under investigation, I nevertheless concur with the judgment of the Department of Justice that you are not able to effectively lead the Bureau."
Again, going back to Trump turning himself into the victim, going back to the fact that they did a physical warrant on Carter Page that got stored emails involving the campaign, which gave Trump the ability to say they were wiretapping the campaign, when, again, one of the things that we're doing was trying to protect the campaign from being used by somebody trying to sell them out. Turned himself into a victim over that. So there were efforts in these tender months of 2017 to reassure Trump. Every time they tried to reassure Trump, though, it blew up in their faces. Trump became more paranoid.
Top Democrats are now demanding answers on Russia.
If an independent special prosecutor is appointed, there still can be some faith that we can get to the bottom of this. If not, everyone will suspect cover-up.
Mr. Trump firing back, crying Chuck Schumer stated recently, "I do not have confidence in Comey any longer," then acts so indignant.
It's not just Democrats. Some Republicans are critical, too. Among them, Richard Burr. He's the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, the ones heading up that Russia investigation.
So in 2018, the HIPSI investigation, they produce a report. And then in 2018, later, Oversight, Intelligence, and Judiciary continue this investigation. This is actually the transition where they're investigating people like Jim Baker.
Mr. Baker, did you handle the dossier? Did you warn Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein that there was exculpatory information before he signed the final surveillance warrant? Mr. Baker, will you take our questions?
This is when Lisa Page and Peter Strzok have to testify publicly, and it's unbelievably contentious.
I'm stating to you, it is not my understanding that he kicked me off because of any bias, that it was done based on the appearance. If you want to represent what you said accurately, I'm happy to answer that question, but I don't appreciate what was originally said being changed. I don't give a damn what you appreciate, Agent Strzok.
So this is where you start seeing the public demonization of those people. But behind closed doors, they do this remarkable interview with the coffee boy, with George Papadopoulos.
The wife of George Papadopoulos, Simona Mangiante Papadopoulos, joins us now along with George. Welcome back. You know, we did that interview several months ago. In the interview, you also talked about George as being like the John Dean in this investigation. Do you still believe that?
Yes, in a different way. I always thought his contribution was going to be important in a way that is not defined yet. And we probably have to wait at the end of this investigation to have a proper assessment of his contribution.
Because remember, Papadopoulos, he is approached by the FBI.
On January 27th, 2017, when you met with the FBI and lied to them about your meetings with Joseph Mifsud. Why did you lie to them?
As you stated quite eloquently, at the time of my interview with the FBI, I think around 3 or 4 days before that, I was at the inauguration attending parties with senior level transition officials. I understood that there was an incipient investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. And I found myself as somebody who worked incredibly hard over the past year with the campaign to actually have the candidate Trump be elected. And then I found myself pinned between the Department of Justice and the sitting president, and having probing questions that I thought might incriminate the sitting
You were
president.
trying to protect the president.
Of course.
Papadopoulos reaches out to Mark Kazowitz, Trump's long-term defense attorney, and says, I need a defense attorney. And then he stops cooperating the same way. But the FBI gets more communications and realizes he has lied about the significance of Joseph Mifsud.
Or as I like to call him, Little Joey.
And then in the summer, they secretly arrest George Papadopoulos. In July of 2017, they secretly arrest him. And they also think that they might be able to get him for being an unregistered agent of Israel. But you can never charge anyone in the United States for being an unregistered, because everyone is, right? But they try and see if he will cooperate, and he doesn't cooperate. And there's an important interview where there are two important interviews. One is George Papadopoulos is asked, did you tell anyone in the campaign? He says, yeah, I may have told Sam Clovis. The next day he comes back and he says, no, I have no memory of telling Sam Clovis. So in other words, he basically admits, and Sam Clovis is suspect for other reasons, but he admits that he told Sam Clovis about the emails, that the Russians had emails, and then he unadmits it.
And it's your testimony that you don't remember telling anyone in the campaign about that. You understand why that's pretty hard to believe. This is pretty big news coming to you. You're wanting to get connected inside this campaign. You're in constant email contact with others in the campaign, and you don't tell them about this?
Well, we have to look back at what was happening around that time. I think around that time is when Corey Lewandowski had just been fired. Paul Manafort had just taken the helm of the campaign.
More importantly, he has shown his own notes. He has shown notes from his diary where, in conjunction with some other sketchy people, in the summer of 2016, he is talking about planning a meeting with Putin's people in London in September of 2016. And the FBI says, look in your notes. What is this meeting with Putin's people in London in 2016? He's like, I just can't read my own notes. I'm sorry. And so at that point, it's clear that there's more going on with Papadopoulos, but he's not going to cooperate. He then is kept on hold until his plea is rolled out in October. And at that point, people start getting to him. This is when Simona, his now wife, starts cultivating him publicly.
Clearly, it's quite alarming, the fact that I married George Papadopoulos in the middle of this storm.
Having met through Joseph Mifsud.
I met through Joseph Mifsud when I said in my first interviews was our Cupid. But today, I still guess who Joseph Mifsud is. I know his connection in Italy. I know his background. And that's why I still think there is a lot to come.
Did you ever suspect that Simona might be connected to Russia? Your dad did.
This is when he starts blabbing to the press, and the FBI is, you're not supposed to be blabbing to the press. When he is sentenced, I really believed I was in the middle of a big thing. I really believed at that point, he's a 20-something guy, and I really believed I was in the middle of world collusion. And then after that, he gets new lawyers, and the new lawyers convince him that it's all a big conspiracy theory.
This lie, this one lie alone, turned this country on its head. We were fed lies about this individual. We were fed lies about what my interactions really were with this person, how I even met him, who his connections were, and how he fits into the whole scandal.
And so George Papadopoulos, and he still does this, like George Papadopoulos spins everything that happened. And this is partly coming out of the Hipsey investigations.
Joining me right now is former Trump campaign advisor and author of the book, Deep State Target, George Papadopoulos. He was a target of the deep state, and he is at the center of much of this.
So they've discovered that Stephen Halper is one of the informants that targeted him. And Stephen Halper is a Republican, but the Republicans try and spin the Stephen Halper thing as really corrupt. That he was framed, that there was a female agent who was part of that operation, and they suggest that she was trying to lead him on to get him to confess.
I want to get your reaction to what we heard yesterday, that now Stephen Halper is being subpoenaed. It was in August of 2016 when the FBI opened their Crossfire Razor probe. That was the probe into General Flynn. Just a month later, Stephen Halper invites you to a London bar Stefan, and you told him at that on that day, September in 2016, that colluding with Russia would be treason, that you would never do such a thing. And they held that back from the FISA court. But right after he invites you to a London bar to chat you up, he's awarded an Office of Net Assessments contract of $411,000, George. And that was, quote unquote, to study China's economy. Tell us who you believe Stefan Halper is, George.
Right. Well, that's, yeah, Stefan Halper, I think, is one of the key players of Spygate and Obamagate. Wow.
And so Stefan Halper begins the start of this conspiracy theory. Then Joseph Mifsud's Swiss attorney, who has ties to Russia, says that Mifsud actually had ties to U.S. intelligence and U.S. State Department people. This is the same story they told with Konstantin Kilimnik, right? They're like, he was at this event sponsored by spooks, and therefore he's actually got ties to U.S. spooks. There are a couple more conspiracy theories they tell, but the important part is George Papadopoulos, in his testimony to this joint committee, Ogre, basically, Mark Meadows is leading it, so he's not at the White House yet. George Papadopoulos tells these conspiracy theories, right? I think that Joseph Mifsud is actually tied to U.S. intelligence.
I should look into him.
I think the two guys who met with me because they wanted to know who the new incoming Trump person was were actually framing me with the intelligence community. I think the CIA was out to get me. I think that he's spewing conspiracy theories, and importantly, these conspiracy theories were all laundered through two sources. The Daily Caller, and here I have to say Chuck Ross actually did important work, but through Chuck Ross, but more importantly through John Solomon.
Right.
So in this interview, where, by the way, George Papadopoulos hasn't handed over any of his communications. So had he handed over his communications, then Democrats would have been able to really question him about what he did. He doesn't hand over any communications. They're going blind. Over and over again, Papadopoulos says, I don't remember. I don't have my communications. I can't tell you. And then they never get the communications and never spin back and hold George Papadopoulos accountable for basically false claims he made in this hearing.
It's about the FBI ignoring exculpatory evidence in their FISA warrant applications. John Solomon joins us along with former Trump campaign aide George Papadopoulos, his wife Simona, who fought so hard for his defense. John, I'll let you break it down.
Sure, yeah, this is really simple.
But in the hearing, he basically cedes the originating conspiracy theories that John Durham then chases with Bill Barr in Italy. And the trajectory of this is really important to remember. Later on, I think we're going to end up talking about Jim Jordan's efforts today to, in the guise of investigation, sick lynch mobs on people like state prosecutors investigating Donald Trump.
Alvin Bragg's prosecution of President Trump is lawfare at its worst.
People fighting Russian disinformation.
The researchers say they're being chilled. That's their truth.
Yeah.
You're saying they're not. So what's the truth?
They can do their research. God bless them. Do all the research you want. Don't say we think this particular tweet is not true.
People who raise cautions about the Hunter Biden laptop.
What spills out of that is the 51 former intel officials in their letter where they say it's a Russian information op, has all the earmarks of a Russian information op. And the long and the short of it is the American people are denied access to an important story.
Investigators of Hunter Biden who were not ready to prosecute him on dodgy evidence.
Special Counsel Weiss just brought charges against Hunter Biden for a single gun incident, and that has seemed to be deeply unsatisfying to Republicans, including yourself.
Well, I think that's largely an attempt to save face. Let's indict him on the gun charge, which has nothing to do with President Biden.
That's where this ends up. In between, importantly, there was a House and oversight investigation that really framed the Durham investigation.
More from the Department of Justice. Bill Barr has appointed the special counsel, John Durham, to keep on the job to investigate the Russia probe origins under the new administration.
And sent him a lot of crazy whack theories to go chase.
And we can't forget that the Durham probe started off as an administrative review The only moment publicly that we knew that it became a criminal matter is after a trip that both Attorney General Barr and John Durham took, not to Russia, but to Italy, to find out about Joseph Mifsud.
Let me talk about collusion. Jim Comey briefed Congress early on. He's asked, are you investigating collusion? Jim Comey explains.
Collusion is not a legal term of art, and it's one I haven't used here today. I said we're investigating to see whether there was any coordination between people associated with the campaign.
Jim Comey told everyone very early on, we would not investigate collusion, not a crime. We would investigate crimes, conspiracy is a crime. Nevertheless, HPSCI from day one was geared towards getting denials of collusion. So if you look at their transcripts, if you look at their investigation, there's a formula for interviewing people. And the formula is always, do you have evidence of collusion? No, I don't have evidence of collusion. No one's going to have evidence of collusion anyway, because collusion's not a thing. Collusion's not a crime. The denialists have loved that James Clapper said, I did not have evidence of collusion.
We did not include any evidence in our report, and I say our, that's NSA, FBI, and CIA with my office, the Director of National Intelligence, that had any reflection of collusion between members of the Trump campaign and the Russians.
James Clapper left government in January 2017. And so when Clapper says, I don't have evidence of collusion, it means the intelligence community has not found overseas evidence of collusion, having only started looking for it in December. By January 2017, he was asked last year, in May of last year, as part of a House investigation, and they're like, well, you said there was no evidence of collusion. And he's, are you kidding me?
Learning, perhaps inadvertently because of Paul Manafort's lawyers, that during the campaign, he shared sensitive internal Trump campaign polling information with a Russian oligarch. He was intending that oligarch in turn would turn it over to two pro-Russian Ukrainian oligarchs who apparently owed him a few $1 million. What does that say to you?
Well, this may not be a smoking gun, Wolf, but it sure is a wisp.
A wisp of what?
Of collusion. I cannot think of an innocent explanation for why the campaign manager for the Trump campaign would share internal polling data with the Russians. Russians tailored their appeals to various groups, either interest groups or on a geographical basis, to meddle with the election and affect its outcome. To me, this is quite significant revelation, inadvertent though it was.
So you're not yet ready to say collusion?
Well, what's the legal definition of collusion? For me, as a layman, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, probably collusion.
Are you saying that Manafort providing polling data to Klimnik is not collusion? Of course that's collusion. And that's a point, is they were asking a bunch of people who were either Republicans to say, no, we don't have any evidence of collusion, or people who didn't know anything about the investigation that started really in earnest in January, March, May of 2017. Do you have any evidence of collusion? No, I don't. But I don't know anything about the investigation. And it's important because that measure, collusion rather than conspiracy, collusion rather than crime, is the other thing, is the other formula to how to beat this rat, right? One is to focus on the dossier. The other one is to deny collusion. And if you saw me getting beat up by Glenn Greenwald and Aaron Mate and all those boys in March 2019, after the report came out, April 2019, they were like, it says there's no evidence of collusion.
Everybody knows, and I don't care how many people try and rewrite history, that the central question that everybody was obsessed with for 3 years was, did Donald Trump, his family members, and his aides conspire and collaborate and collude with the Russians to interfere in the election? And contrary to what David just said, it is absolutely false that Robert Mueller simply said there's not enough evidence to convict with a reasonable doubt. He said something much, 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 much more important than that. He said that after 20 months of investigation, with a huge team of FBI agents and prosecutors heralded as being the most aggressive and skilled in the world, we found no evidence that this happened. That's what Robert Mueller said. The whole thing was a scam and a fraud from the beginning. And the New York Times headline today says that as clearly as it can. Robert Mueller finds no collusion between Trump and Russia. That was the focal point of the entire narrative, no matter how much people try and change the focus. The second point, this idea that, oh, we haven't heard from Robert Mueller yet. We've only heard Bill Barr's summary of him. Yes, that's true. But Bill Barr has been friends with Robert Mueller for 30 years.
They still say this as if it means anything. Even though there was an ongoing investigation into conspiracy with Roger Stone, even though Paul Manafort pled guilty to conspiring with Konstantin Kilimnik, and had Mueller had the time and interest in prosecuting him for lying about covering up the polling data question, the August 2, 2016 meeting, that would have been conspiracy as well. So yes, the Mueller investigation did show a lot of evidence of conspiracy. It didn't show collusion because he didn't look for collusion. And Jim Comey told them before the entire thing started, there was going to be no collusion because it doesn't exist. The FBI does not investigate collusion. So that's a framework that it's important to understand, is that was set from the start. That was set by people like Kash Patel, Devin Nunes, people who are all part of Truth Social. That's the way HPSCI sets up its hearing. They also, importantly, they didn't interview Mike Flynn. They didn't interview Paul Manafort. They didn't interview Rick Gates. All those people not asked whether there was any collusion.
Why all the lies?
We know that both Roger Stone and Michael Cohen were prosecuted for lying to them. Michael Cohen said his lie was coordinated with Trump, with Jared's people, probably with Felix Sater. So that was a coordinated lie. We're going to cover up the Trump Tower Moscow together. Roger Stone covered up his real source of information on the Russian hack and leak. There were people, Michael Caputo, Steve Bannon, Jared Kushner, who denied having evidence that the Mueller investigation later found. The HPSCI investigation was not very forthright, but its goal was not to find the truth. Its goal was to set up a cover.
Thanks for listening to Ball of Thread. Expect a new episode about every 2 weeks until the election. To support this series and get answers to your questions with a bonus Q&A podcast, go to patreon.com/balloffthread. You can join us for as little as $1 a month. We appreciate your sharing this work with anyone who cares about the Constitution, and please consider giving us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts.